Hello, welcome to our speaker series. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Patricia Martinelli, the author of 11 books, including The Fantastic Castle of Vineland, George Dana and the Palace of Depression, also New Jersey Ghost Towns, Uncovering the Hidden Past, and also Haunted New Jersey, Ghosts and Strange Phenomena of the Garden State, and more. Patricia Martinelli is the curator of the Vineland Historical and Antiquarian Society. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today.
She was one of my first interns. Very proud. Well, thank you so much, folks, for coming out today. We'll practice in giving these kind of presentations, so I will give your forgiveness. But before we talk about the actual convention itself and the folks who were involved with all of that, I'd like to give a little bit of historic perspective on life in America that preceded the convention by about 20 years. Because when you work in the history field long enough, you discover that just about everything can have roots even further back than you expected or anticipated to find. And in this particular case, it's kind of relevant to know that in the 1840s, there was all kinds of turmoil, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Over in Europe, you had monarchies were being contested by the public. The economy was falling apart because industry was not able to keep its workers employed. And over here in America, you basically had a lot of stuff going on as far as the states fighting the newly formed federal government for their rights. And that caused a lot of confrontation. By 1848, all of a sudden everything seems to explode because the anti-slavery movement starts to gain real momentum. The Women's Suffrage Convention is held in Seneca Falls, New York. And that sent a shockwave throughout the country because who are these women and how dare they think that they were entitled to have rights? And then you had people who were just basically looking at some of the beliefs of the Transcendental movement, which had occurred in America at that time, thanks to people like Henry David Thoreau. And you just found that people were starting to say, why have things been established the way they are, and who says we have to keep it this way? And in the midst of all this, you had the Rochester knockings, which was what created the Spiritualist movement in America. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with that story, in a nutshell, it was these two mischievous little sisters by the name of Fox who decided to play a trick on their family, particularly their mother, and make believe that there were ghosts in the house and that they were the ones who could interpret what the knockings meant and what the ghosts wanted. And they went on to make quite a successful career at this, and only admitted many, many years later, when they were older and a lot wiser, that, well, it was all in fun. They really weren't trying to hurt anybody. But there were a lot of people who took all this very seriously. And one of the reasons this all spread so quickly, both the pros and cons of all the social movements, was the fact that all of a sudden literacy was on the rise. People had access to cheaply printed books and literature, and they started learning to read, which was something they had never had an opportunity to do before. And word was getting out. So the more questions were raised, the more people started to wonder, is life the way it's supposed to be? Because by then, capitalism had not completely overwhelmed our society, but it was on its way. And the people at the bottom of the barrel especially wanted to know why it was so. So anyway, the Civil War came along and kind of shot a hole in just about every movement that was going on in America at that point in time, because everybody swung their support around to the abolition of slavery and a lot of other issues that were going on. But what happened was, when that was all over, people started getting together again and talking to one another and sharing different ideas. I mean, these ideas hadn't been erased completely. We know for a fact that over in Hamilton, they had a thriving spiritualism community in the 1850s. But for the most part, they were sort of low key. And it wasn't until we had all these groups looking at other states and saying, well, they're forming state societies to do a better job of getting the word out, that interest started to grow and develop in creating a state society of spiritualists for New Jersey. And that's where Vineland comes into play. Vineland was a brand new little community. It was only 5 years old. And no one knows really the reason why it was selected to become the site of the first state convention for the Spiritualists. But it wasn't the first time these kind of events had been held in Vineland. It's part of its little known history. For example, that same year, we had the first Holiness Revival Convention in New Jersey, which attracted more than 10,000 people to Landis Park. And you had, afterward, you had the first state convention for women's suffrage held in a place called Plum Street Hall, which was the venue everyone flocked to because it was the place where unpleasant truths could be told. And they were proud of that because a lot of people were pulling away from mainstream religions for the very reason that they felt mainstream religion simply reinforced the social structure at that time. And the people on the bottom of that economic ladder were looking up and going, yeah, there's something wrong with this picture, and we need to see what can be done. So just to give you a little firsthand, well, not necessarily firsthand account, but my interpretation of firsthand accounts. I'm going to read you a few paragraphs out of my book, where it says, although May 24th, 1866 dawned as a warm spring day, much like any other, there seemed to be an almost electric hum in the air. For months, the preparations of New Jersey's first spiritualism convention had been going nonstop. Letters had been written to kindred souls throughout the country, newspaper announcements appeared in some highly select publications, and beds were aired in preparation for the crowd that was expected to descend upon the village of about 5,000 residents. The hotels and boarding houses planned to squeeze in as many guests as they could who could afford the $1 a night stay, and prominent local citizens like John and Portia Gage, who were both spiritualists, assisted by opening their elegant white clapboard-sided home on Southeast Avenue to some of the guest speakers who arrived from out of state. Because they did not limit this to New Jersey residents. And the feedback that they got from some highly significant people made a big difference on the success of the event. So, and we'll go on to that in detail in a little bit. Spiritualism continued to grow in the years that followed. But as you know, when you get more than 2 people together to discuss anything, there's always division. There's always people who say it's going to be my way or the highway. So you sometimes had smaller groups who just chose to continue to operate on their own and not under the auspices of a state society. But a lot of a lot of the local societies decided they wanted that imprint of being a part of the state organization. So they sent up board members and participants in an event just to try and get people to pay attention to what was going on. So you had people like Dr. Henry Child, who was present at the first state convention. And Dr. Child was from Philadelphia. And he was ardent about spiritualism for one very basic reason. When the cholera plague hit Philadelphia, he lost not only his wife, but his firstborn child. And this just completely devastated him, and he found no solace in mainstream religion. So he turned to spiritualism. And on the night of the first convention, he decided that he was going to be there to help the help the New Jersey folks get themselves organized. And in a very dramatic reading, since he was the first guest speaker, he closed his presentation that the host of heavens had served as witness of the importance of the convention. He said, "We are touching heartstrings, which will send their thrilling tone down to coming centuries. In voting for the constitution for the formation of the society, we should feel that we are putting our hands to the plow, not alone for ourselves, but for coming generations." So, as you can see, Dr. Child wasn't definitely a true believer who really felt that spiritualism had something to offer, because what a lot of people don't realize is that while the talking to the dead was important, these were people who were equally, if not more so, interested in social change. At the time, you had homelessness. You had hungry people in the streets. You had people working for companies that didn't give a damn if they worked a 10 or 12-hour day or if their arm got mangled in a steam press. There were no rights for workers in those days. And they wanted to use spiritualism as a source of change. In fact, one of my favorite quotes that I have put on the back of the book is, "The present government is a blasphemy upon the name of liberty, and we must revolutionize. Break the chains that bind women and no longer be ruled by money aristocracy." Sound very familiar? So anyway, Vineland itself had about 300 spiritualists living there at the time all this was going on. Their presence was not well received as Vineland started to grow and become a little more staid and proper in its Victorian spirit. What you had, the impetus behind that was the fact that Charles Landis shot the newspaper editor in 1875, and they tried to brush him aside. So the last thing they wanted was for the spiritualists to be giving their town any more of what they felt was a bad reputation with all these goofy and flaky behaviors that were being exhibited. But it didn't stop the spiritualists. So, unfortunately, though, one of the things that did start to damage their presence, not just in Vineland, but throughout the state, was the fact that you had people there who were flat out con-artists. And their sole purpose for being involved with spiritualism was just to see how many hooks they can catch of the people who were present in their audience and how much money they could make and take them for. But at the same time, the true believers continued to hang in there. And one of the things that interested me most in my research was the fact that I discovered that a Mrs. Lily Palmer, who was one of the founders of Lilydale in New York, which had become the premier spiritualism community in America and still is, she lived in Vineland while all this was going on. So chances are very good that this is where she learned more in order to move forward with her belief in religion. Okay, so who was there? Brittany? Go to the video. Technical difficulties, folks. I'm not surprised. Technology hates me these things. There we go. The gentleman on your left is John Gage. John Gage was a very successful businessman who made millions from flour manufacturing out in Chicago. So after he and his wife had 11 children and John retired from his business life, they had moved to a lovely estate in the suburbs of Chicago. And one day John came home and said to Portia, "We're moving to Vineland." And Portia said, "No." And John, as he usually did, got his way. So they packed up the remaining children that were still living at home and left behind the ones that were already married and out the door. and they moved to Vineland, where they became what I call the power couple that oversaw just about all social activist causes in Vineland at that point in time. In fact, in 1867, after they held the suffrage convention in Vineland, John was elected the very first president of the Vineland chapter of the Equal Rights Association that they formed there on the strength of that convention. So Portia would go on the following year, in 1868, to stage what was then the country's largest women's suffrage protest when she brought 172 Vineland women to the voting box to vote in the first presidential election after the Civil War. So these were people who didn't like to take no for an answer. And when spiritualism was ringing out, John was right there in the front line, spreading the word and contacting everyone he knew, because he did know a lot of people. On the other slide, you have Cornelius Bowman Campbell. As you can see, Cornelius has that kind of hypnotic stare that kind of locks you in that whatever Cornelius believes is right. Cornelius studied for many years to become a minister in a more traditional faith, but decided no, spiritualism was the route for him. So he moved out to the Midwest, where he became a conductor on the Underground Railroad and risked his life to help slaves who were fleeing north to get a new start in life. While he was out there, he met and married a young widow, and like John Gage, he decided that with everything that Landis was advertising about Vineland, it was definitely a place that he wanted to be a part of. He, in fact, became the very first president of the Vineland Historical Society because he was a New Englander, as was most of our early residents. And he felt we needed to preserve our history, and thank goodness for me, because these people wrote down everything and kept everything. So that's made my life a lot easier over the years. But Cornelius was somebody else that you didn't say no to, and both of these men were fast friends with Charles Landis. Now, where was Charles in all this? Sitting quietly on the sidelines, as he so often did. Technically, Charles was a Methodist. He was a member of the First United Methodist Church, which was already in existence in Vineland. But when it came to projects, he kind of let other people take point on a lot of what was going on. He would pay for land for people to build schools and build churches of just about every denomination you could think of. And so when the Spiritualists came along and said they wanted to do a convention, he wasn't going to say no. Because for him, in a lot of ways, this was a great way to get new people to Vineland. And that was where his focus primarily was. Let's get new settlers here. Okay, so next slide, please. These were two of the most important people at the convention on May 24th, 1866. We don't know them today. They're not people whose names have really lived on outside of certain circles. But Andrew Jackson Davis and his wife Mary. Andrew Jackson was considered the father of American spiritualism. And his wife Mary was a medium, so she had access to the other side. Andrew Jackson was born in upstate New York. He was very poor, but he was also a very intelligent young man, and he was one of those people who learned to read very early and eventually studied the words of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish mystic whose beliefs were in keeping with spiritualism. Jackson would go on, or Davis would go on to become known as the gypsy seer because he used his gifts to help treat people with medical issues. As you know, back in those days, there was no standard effort for medicine. Pretty much anybody could call themselves a doctor or practice medicine. And that's pretty much what he did. And a lot of people believed in his gifts. They believed that he was able to heal them. Okay, and another person whose fame was with us to this day, Victoria C. Woodhull. Her second husband, James Blood, and Victoria's younger sister, Tennessee, or Tenny, as she was more commonly known, were there in Vineland in 1866. Now, I know most of you are probably not history geeks, even though you have obviously an interest in history, But my jaw kind of dropped to about here. The Victoria Woodhull came to Vineland in 1866, long before she was ever known as a leader of the suffrage movement. Victoria was a medium. She had a lot of spiritual gifts, but unfortunately she was born into a large family whose parents thought nothing of pimping out their kids at every opportunity to use them to rake in money. And they did that to Victoria. So when she had an opportunity to, as a teenager, to escape into a bad marriage, she took that opportunity and moved on. But unfortunately, her first husband, he was just about as bad as her parents. So when the time was right, she managed to get a divorce, and she met Colonel Blood, who was a Civil War veteran, who absolutely worshipped the ground she walked on. She could do nothing wrong, and he supported her interest in spiritualism every step of the way. They would hold spiritualist gatherings at their home, and Tennessee was a part of all that, but not to the same degree her sister was. And what's most interesting about Victoria from this perspective is that Victoria actually went on to take down some of the traditional church leaders in her day, but we'll talk a little further about that a little further along. So, next week. Okay, so Hosea Allen, this little self-righteous figure. He was the guy who, when the time came to arrest Charles Landis for shooting the newspaper editor in Vineland, he was happy to do it because he was the person who upheld the law in Vineland at that point in time. But he was a believer, mainly because his wife Julia was a medium. So he didn't want to undermine the work that she was doing because she was making a decent income giving readings to local people. But Hosea's role is still a little bit more of that of a supportive player when it came to the spiritualism aspect of what happened then. Okay, George and Margaret Pryor. About 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a women's history bus tour up to the Rochester area in New York and go to Central Falls. And carved into a stone circle just outside the little church where they held the reading of the Women's Constitution, they've carved the names of the people who signed the Constitution. George and Margaret were two of those people. They later moved to Vineland, and even though they were Quakers to some degree, they felt spiritualism did offer them some insight that they were seeking into their own lives. So they got involved with the movement down here and were present at just about every convention that was held, not just in Vineland, but throughout the state. Next. Okay, and then we have these two lovely ladies who were local spiritualists. And if you go back, Miss Harvey and Miss Mills, if you go back to local papers from that period of time, you'll see these lovely little advertisements talking about, well, Mrs. Mills is giving readings from her home on West Avenue, and Mrs. Sykes is taking customers at a room on Landis Avenue, and they charged a pretty hefty sum. It was like $1 to go for a reading, which in those days was a lot of money. But again, for a time, they were quite successful. Okay, and here we have George and Sarah Pearson. Sarah was believed to have had some mediumistic talent, but I was never able to find any record of her actually being in the front lines of the mediums that were there. But George was a very proactive person in the community. He tried to get out and get involved with all the different causes that were there. And George, being a very much pragmatic person, may have seen this as a good business opportunity more than he did from the religious social aspect. That's something that still needs to be looked further into. Good. Okay, and I don't know if you can see it, but this is Dr. George Haskell. And if you look closely behind his head there, you see the figure of two women. Dr. Haskell started Ancora. long before it became infamous for its psychiatric facilities. It was a spiritualist community that he started with about 24 families. He was going to build an industrial school up there for both men and women so that they could get training and go out and do real work, technical school. But unfortunately, Dr. Haskell did not live long enough to see his community come to fruition, and after he died, about 10 years after his community started, the rest of them pretty much gave up and moved away to other places. So that was kind of sad because it was another big dream. And to this day, there are people who say there are segments of Angkor that are haunted, so who knows if some of the spiritualists still hanging out there doing what they believe they needed to do. And this is one of my personal favorites, Moses Hall. Moses was a pure believer in spiritualism, but his biggest fear was that in years that had not yet come along, believers would not maintain the same level of purity in their beliefs as he and his generation did. Of course, his purity of belief included an open marriage contract, but he fell madly in love with one of his fellow spiritualists, a woman named Maddie Sawyer, who returned his affection because ultimately Elvira gave him a divorce, and Moses and Maddie got married and moved out west to run a spiritualism enclave out in Illinois, and then moved back to New England, where he was originally from, where they finished out their days. Maddie was a medium, and unfortunately, there is not a lot known about her personal life, other than she really started to develop spiritualist gifts when she was about 12. Well, this whole thing was bad for spiritualism as a whole because it showed just how immoral these people. They had no right mixing in foreign society. And Moses' problem were caused by Reverend Hammond, known locally in Cumberland as Rancher, because he was an evangelical preacher, and the people in Vineland really didn't have much use for him. So he got the law to listen to him. However, Moses and Maddie were arrested. Maddie was let go because she was, after all, only a woman. And Moses, fortunately, escaped prosecution, but was basically told to take it back elsewhere for at least a little while. So local spiritualists were embarrassed enough so that they kind of turned their back on him as well at that point in time. And it wasn't until many years later that he and Maddie came back to Vineland together to preach and to bring in believers, because spiritualism stayed on. You know, even though it wasn't always, and they openly acknowledged, as it had been for those first 10 years after the convention, there were believers in Vineland. This is Plum Street Hall, where it all happened. It wasn't very big. It was like 40 feet by 60 feet in size, which for those days was a fairly good sized building. And it would later be rechristened as the new auditorium and Cosmopolitan Hall. So it served the community for many years, but after it stopped being Plum Street Hall, it just became basically an entertainment center where people went to go and watch shows or see plays, that kind of thing, or hear concerts. One of the most interesting things about Plum Street Hall after it became Cosmopolitan Hall, a little bit of historic trivia for you, is that a local gentleman named John Paul went to Philadelphia to a church choir. He worked in Vineland as a janitor. He was an escaped slave who had relocated there, and he heard this one young woman singing as part of the choir with the voice of an angel. And he said to her, "You need to come to Vineland, and you need to perform for people there." Well, she was a little hesitant at first because she wasn't sure, because she was African American, how well received she would be. But when she got there, she played to a packed audience. That young woman's name was Marian Anderson, the opera singer, who went on to great fame in our history. But we always like to say another Vineland first. So again, let's go to the next one. Here were some of the people who essentially were running the cons. There were many, 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 many more. And somehow at some point they always seem to land in Vineland for various reasons. Claire d'Evrier used to go by several variations of that same name. And they would change their name when they moved town to town as a way of staying ahead of the law. And of course, you can see the anniversary poster there for the spirit wrapping, which always drew a big crowd because they danced. And people loved to come out and dance. Violent people would throw parties for any reason, any occasion. We have anniversary posters from the 7th anniversary, the 12th, the 23rd, you name it, there was always an excuse, let alone major anniversary. So going to Plum Street Hall, and then of course being able to meet Dr. Coonley and enjoy the spirit wrappings. And then you had people like Mr. Hildreth and Mr. Wilson, who had already been found out to be fakes elsewhere, but they were welcome to Vineland once again. And Mr. Wilson especially hung on for about a week or so doing readings in his room, just to prove that he wasn't a fake, but everybody kind of knew he was. There was a Philadelphia institution that had evaluated him, and they found out not only was he like doing chalk writing with his knees, he was essentially really, really, really just doing all the wrong things, which has impacted the name of spiritualism. Can we take a break for just a minute? I think I need some water. I'm sorry, folks. A test meeting was where they go to see if anybody has gifts, where people can come up and be tested to see if they have any real spiritual gifts, which basically was all fake because it was just his way of, seeing who the competition might be and whether or not he can lure them into working with him. So the biggest scandal of all, I think, is coming up now. Katie King. Now, I don't know if you folks are familiar with the Katie King scandal, which rocked not just Philadelphia, but most of America at that point in time. Because Katie King was, is it a take a chair and just sit over here? Yeah, I'll get one right here. Yeah, they never did put years on the poster. This would have been, oh wait, there's one down here. This was 1868 from Miss Terrace. So Katie had come and gone a few times, as you can see in Vineland. But the story behind her is rather interesting because over in London, Katie became a really big attraction when she was presented as the living embodiment of the daughter of the pirate Morgan. And she would materialize on stage. But it was kind of interesting because the room always had to have no back doors and space for a big closet where, a person could maybe change and come out dressed as a ghost. And people kept trying to discredit her. And the Ferrises, who were using another name at the time they were working with her. And after a while, it was proven that she was in fact a fake. But what's interesting is you had Dr. Child and another gentleman by the name of Robert Dale Owen, who was a nationally known activist, social activist in America at that point in time. They were in her corner, so they were tarred by the same brush by way of what Katie did wrong. But Mrs. Ferris and her husband decided that since that act was no longer working, they would go off on their own, and they moved to Vineland for a while. So again, another connection. They came and she set up practice, and the phenomenon of the iron ring supposedly were two circles that she managed to unlock from one another with the power of one. But they stayed long enough so that they could put together some funds and ran out west, where again they just moved from town to town for as long as they could. And today, we have the Church of Eternal Life in Westville, New Jersey. A lovely little chapel. It sits on a side street back there. It sort of inherited the bits and pieces of spiritual believers from different towns in the United States. I believe there is one other location up in North Jersey, but unfortunately that minister refused to cooperate as far as talking to me at all, whereas the minister for this church, she was more than welcoming when we went up for a service and talking to me afterwards. But what's interesting is that while she's on stage, and I sort of believe, we had talked earlier about whether or not I was a believer, but I sort of believe she turned to me at one point and she said, "There's someone here who has a message for you." So I said, "Sure, why not?" And she started telling me that this person was always very concerned when I was driving, especially when I made left-hand turns, because anybody who knows me, well, they drive like a maniac. So she's going on, and I'm thinking, well, she said he rides with me when I'm in the car just to make sure I'm safe. And I'm thinking, well, it's probably my father, because my father was always he was a car guy, and he always drilled into me certain things I had to do to be safe on the road. So I'm thinking it's my dad. And she looks up and then she goes, "Does the name Carl have any meaning for you?" Well, I did want to be, because Carl was a long lost boyfriend from back in my 20s, who at that time was a violent police officer, and he too would also yell at me about my life. So now the standing joke among me and my friends is when we get in, we make sure Carl's buckled in safely. But between the early 1900s and when these folks came along, you had people turning away from a a state organization and going back to just their local town or their region and working together. And they held meetings, some of which were dubious, some of which brought the believers together. They stopped being concerned about social causes like the early people were, and they started just looking at it as an opportunity to meet with deceased friends and relatives and loved ones. The people we talked to who were members of this congregation, I would say 95% of them were there because they had in fact lost a loved one. And they felt that this was a great place for them to become a part of a community that would understand. But it's one of these beliefs that there are still, like I say, there's Pasadena down in Florida, there's Little Dale up in New York, and other smaller sites around America. And I've been saying sometimes it's just a matter of faith. And if you believe, and this is what works for you, then lucky you. That's all I do. So that pretty much brings us to the end of everything, folks. Does anybody have any questions? No? Yes. Well, the idea of letting and long because that's an excellent question, because Andrew Jackson Davis actually had seen Mesmer speak, and he became a practitioner of animal magnetism himself. And he claimed during his early life, he was able to have out-of-the-body experiences where, in fact, he did talk face-to-face with Swedenborg and some other spiritual leaders. And I think it was just the idea of freeing the spirit from the body that caught his attention more than anything else. And he felt if it could be done that way, then why is it, well, once we die, we necessarily leave our spirit or leave our body and just go to a different plane? So, where you can't contact, because for these folks, it was a case of no matter what plane you were on, contact was always available if you were able to listen. And one of their basic beliefs was just, treat each other as you would have others treat you. And that's where the social stuff came in. And they tried to use that connection with the other side to promote better life for the average person. They would say, well, Uncle George, who passed on last year, recommends that you help the hungry, you help the homeless, you do these things to be a better person. And 9 times out of 10, the people would listen because they figure if the message is coming from Uncle George, then it's got to be the truth. So you were going to ask this question?
2 questions.
Yes.
Is Casa Davis still
As far as I know, yes. I had family that was living down there up until a few years ago, and they said they would still see people on Casa Davis every year. But Lilydale, even though it's a small community now, you have mediums who live there year round, and in the summer they do public programs, and the archives is open to the public, and they say they attract anywhere from 20 to 30,000 people every year still. Yeah.
That's New York.
That's in New York, yeah. Where in New York? I believe it's upstate New York. It's just kind of interesting in a lot of ways how many movements started in upstate New York. I don't know if there's something in the middle or.
Burned over district.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Edgar Casey, is there any?
Edgar Casey.
He's a little later.
Yeah, and what I tried to do, I mean, some people were asking, like, how much did I talk about the spiritualist medium process itself? But that wasn't the focus of this book. This focus really was just on the organization of the society and what it was doing here in New Jersey. I mean, it would have been so easy just to sort of broaden the scope a little more, but I couldn't afford to lose another 7 years of my life on more research. So when the time came, the spirit said to me, "This is it, set it down." Yes.
You mentioned early on that there are a number of state organizations forming. Are you familiar with the one in Massachusetts?
There, I believe Massachusetts served as a role model for the New Jersey one. But you have to remember, a lot of the people in Vineland trace their roots back up to New England area. And like even Moses Cole, this was where he was from. So they stayed in regular contact. I mean, these were folks who wrote letters every day. This is what they did. And the mail actually got delivered.
I would also be regard to this real written.
Oh, okay.
And the only written biographical thing I have about it, so with a doctor, but and he was a noted Puritan. And in fact, he was involved in the abolition movement.
Yeah.
In the 1840s.
And
was actually killed by a mob campaigning for Lincoln.
wow.
In Boston.
Wow. That's such a great story. There were.
He had a daughter as well, who was deaf and dumb.
Yeah.
But who was a medium, he was handwrite.
Okay. I mean, there were national conventions of spiritualists even in those days, and a lot of people from the New Jersey organization did participate in that. And they also wrote for different spiritualism publications. Very famous ones like the Banner of Light. They would collect reports from all over the country because this was the way that the spiritualists could stay in touch with each other. So you had no standardized post office and those things too. It was contact me through the Banner, and the Banner would forward the messages on. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming out today, folks. I hope I was able to.
Thank you, Pat.
You're welcome. So if anybody decides they want me to autograph a copy of the book for you, please let me know. And I